I'm Jim McAdam. I'm director of the Irish Agroforestry Forum, and we're standing here on the Agri-Food and Bioscience Institute research farm at Loughgall, County Armagh. And we're standing in one of the longest running agroforestry trials in Europe, and I established this site in 1989-1990. You can see all around me the size of the trees and the pasture that's there, and there are livestock in grazing here with us. Just to go back to those days to think about the rationale behind this idea of silvopasture or introducing trees into grassland. In the late 1970s and 1980s, there was a lot of concern over the effect of grassland intensification on the environment. Things like loss of biodiversity, loss of hedgerows, intensification, monoculture species grass, overgrazing, all those issues were starting to bite. And we had the idea of agri-environment schemes coming in and the measures to introduce to try and make farming more environmentally friendly. But a group of us across the UK got together to look at ways that we could introduce trees into grassland system, because we knew the benefit that trees have overall, but there was very little or no experience in the British Isles really of introducing trees intimately into grassland systems. We looked around the world at models where this had been tried before. There had been ideas in Chile and in New Zealand, and we particularly liked the New Zealand model, where they've had a lot of problems with overgrazing and with soil erosion caused by sheep grazing in high density and on steep sides of valleys. So they'd planted wide-spaced trees, in their case Pinus radiata, and that had consolidated the soil, enabled the pasture to grow up between it, and able to continue grazing. So we looked at trying to test that model here in these islands to see if the same principles would work and if we could develop a system where we could introduce trees onto farms but still continue to farm. That was what our main driver. None of us were foresters in those days. We were really people interested in making livestock systems more sustainable by using trees within them. So we set up a trial across the British Isles, and we 6 sites altogether, 2 of those in Northern Ireland, 1 here at Loughgall and 1 up at Brashean, County Antrim, where we compared 3 different systems under very strict scientific rigour and under proper replicated trial testing. We compared open grassland, just like the area you see behind me, and we compared that with normal woodland planting and 2 systems of silvopasture. That is, we planted trees at wide spacing in the grass themselves and continued to graze those plots along with the grass-only plots. We established those in 1989, protected the trees from the sheep. Obviously, we tested it as a sheep system. It's much easier to protect trees from the sheep. And on all those 6 sites, we did exactly the same thing. We managed the grass the same way. We used the common stock of trees, same fertilizer, same everything, so that we could be sure that the results we got were absolutely replicable and we could stand behind them. And we found that yes, you could grow trees at wide spacing in grassland, and that the farmer, in this case the farm manager at Loughgall, Ian Dodds, was able to manage the sheep, manage the pasture as he would normally manage grassland. The grass grew as well because we had the plots alongside where there were no trees to compare it. And the animals particularly found this environment particularly good. The animals were getting shade and shelter from the elements, and the trees were bringing a lot of benefit to them. They would tend to move around, congregate with the trees. And we all knew the benefits that trees normally bring to everything, to every situation, if you like, but we wanted to prove those benefits applied in this type of situation where you had wide-spaced trees and pasture. So thanks to our links with Queen's University, we were able to get access to research students and do our own research within the department to look at all the aspects of biodiversity. We looked at earthworms, beetles, spiders, birds, wild plants and everything. So we looked at how having trees at this wide spacing would have the effect that would have on grassland. And because we always had the no trees comparison beside it and with the woodland comparison, we were able to make good conclusions on how the system was working. What we found was, surprisingly, we were able to keep the level of production from the pasture, the level of animal output from the pasture. We were able to keep it the same as where there were no trees until the trees got to about 12-year-old. And by that time, the canopies were starting to close and the trees, because the trees had grown really well at this wide spacing. We made a decision then to take out a quarter of the trees to let some light back in and let the pasture pick up again and let sheep production continue at the same level as it was outside the trees. And we've done 3 more thinnings of this bit of woodland that we're in at the minute, this bit of silvopasture. These trees were all planted at 5-metre spacings, that's 400 trees per hectare. Other bits of research we'd done had worked out that that was roughly the optimum density to introduce trees into pasture at. It would allow the trees and the grass to grow synergy with each other, and then gradually you could thin out the trees as they grew, and the canopy shade was affecting the pasture. So now, because we've done those 3 or 4 thinnings, we're now down to about 120 or 130 trees per hectare in this plot that we're on. So on this site today, really, we have trees that are 34 to 34 odd years old. We have 3 replicate plots of those where we're still able to take measurements. Unfortunately, I suppose the species that we chose to research was ash, because in those days, I mean, ash was a great tree for the Irish environment. It produced good timber, it grew well in this climate, and it had a light shade. The leaves came on late in the year, fell off early, and animals liked them. So it was an ideal tree for silvopasture. Of course, we couldn't have known what would happen to ash with ash dieback disease coming in. But by that stage, really, I think we'd proven all the principles that you can grow trees at wide spacing in pasture. You can manage animals in that type of situation, and the benefits that it brings to animals are really substantial and do well. In the early days, this trial was set up really to show that grassland could be made more sustainable. As we went through the 2000s, the whole talk of climate change started to bite, and people were starting then to look at grassland systems which would be more sustainable and which would help be more resilient against the type of challenges that climate change was going to bring. So we were particularly interested in, for example, carbon storage in soil. When we started the trials, there was no real carbon, was not an issue at all. But now that we're concerned about storing carbon in soil, taking carbon out of the atmosphere, there was a renewed interest in a system like this. The biodiversity crisis has hit us badly, obviously, in intensive farmed areas in particular, and having those trees brings added biodiversity, which we now have a renewed interest in. Water runoff, flood prevention is now a big issue. Rainfall is getting heavier and in much heavier bursts. So there's a big problem with runoff of water into our lochs and rivers. We know the crisis Loch Ness is in because of changing climate and the way that things are affecting it. We found with these trees that they were able to take water into the soil more and prevent runoff. Porosity that the tree roots create was opening up the soil, allowing water to get in, and also allowing soil microflora and soil microbes to create a more healthy soil environment. So really, where we have trees integrated with grassland, we're creating a set of situations which are delivering not only livestock production, but very welfare-friendly livestock production, and at the same time delivering all those sort of wildlife and nature-based benefits that we want from a system and that we can go ahead with trying to promote for a more sustainable farming future. Thinking back over the last 30, 35 years this trial's been running, what are some of the things that we have learnt that we can look back on and that are particularly relevant today to the challenges that we're facing? Well, first of all, from a point of view of growing trees at wide spacing, With a lot of knowledge about how to grow trees close together in a woodland or a forestry situation, there wasn't much experience with growing trees at wide spacing, how they would perform, how the trees would perform, and how they could be managed. So, for example, a tree like this beside me, the diameter and the tree growth in that has really been exceptional because of the spacing it's been at. But there's a lot of branches in those trees, and foresters are producing timber. You don't like a lot of branches. And that was really because, as I said, most of us who were interested in this work, we were agronomists, we were sheep husbandry people. We did not have the experience of how to manage the trees. We were just interested in seeing could we get trees growing in this scenario, and we did. Now we have foresters on board, we have people who are interested in the quality and type of trees to grow here. We're learning a lot more about tree management, and that you can actually produce valuable timber in this type of scenario if you manage those trees by pruning. And because you've only got a few trees per hectare, a fairly small number, then you can put time into individual trees and manage them. So from a tree perspective, we found that information on the types, the species you can grow, and we found information on how they grow and how they don't need fertilizer, and they don't take nutrients away from the grass. At the end of the day, we measured the nutrients in the leaves of the grass and in the trees, and we never found there was any competition between the two from that perspective. From the point of view of, and if you compare, for example, the trees behind me are trees that's one of the woodland plots where the trees were planted 2 meters apart, no grazing ever. And there we have a lot of trees, tall, fairly thin trees growing up, and they would have been managed for timber, but we don't have anything like the diameter growth or the volume of timber that we have where we have this wide spacing. And we obviously haven't been able to continue to make money from those plots from the point of view of grazing them and having a sheep output from them. The other things we learnt were about soil, really, and that is becoming increasingly important. There's a lot of concern about our soil health and our soil health and just the quality and nutritional value of soil. And we now know a lot more about what effect trees have on that soil, in that below us here we have a whole network going from tree to tree of tree roots, and those go right down as far as over 1 meter deep, and they're absorbing nutrients in the soil. They're absorbing any excess nutrients that escape below the grass level into the soil, and they're opening that soil up for earthworms and other insects and bacteria that just make the soil much more healthy. The other thing they're doing, which is of real interest to farmers, is those roots are making the soil, they're drying out the soil in the winter. They're allowing the water to escape away through the soil. And that means you can carry animals on the ground a lot longer into the winter or earlier in the spring, because the soil is just that bit drier and has a better carrying capacity. In other words, we can extend the grazing season. Now, we would estimate now that, for example, in this plot, the grazing season, we could graze about 17 or 18 weeks a year longer where we have these trees than out in the plots where there are no trees, simply because the trees have modified the soil environment so much. Now, that's a tremendous benefit. If you can keep animals out of a house for another 3 months at the end of the season, and maybe a month earlier or two at the beginning of the season to get them out onto pasture. That has tremendous benefits for animal welfare. Obviously, animals that are outside are healthier, they have less risk of pneumonia and respiratory diseases. And from the point of view of gaseous emissions, it really reduces our ammonia emissions substantially. When animals are housed, their dung and urine is mixing, and that produces ammonia. And that's one of the big challenges we have with farming in Ireland, is to reduce the amount of ammonia coming from livestock systems. And one way you can do that, one nature-based solution, is to try and keep animals out of a house as long as possible. In other words, extend the length of your grazing season. So what we would tend to do with these plots now, if this was on our farm, we would say keep some grass on these plots for later in the season and graze up your other fields, so that as it starts to get wetter in the autumn, and the ability of the soil to carry animals gets less, then use these plots for autumn grazing, and that can give you that extra couple of months of keeping the animals out of a house. And likewise in spring. We found the benefit was better in autumn. We've probably got about twice as much extension to the grazing season in autumn as we did in the spring. So the effect just of the trees on the soil is really bringing that benefit. The other thing, I mean, the system is always ticking a lot of boxes. It's working, it works well. How do we sell that to farmers, and how do we persuade farmers that this is something they can integrate into their own farms? And that's really one of the challenges we have. Obviously government support is important, and in the south you have a good grant for agroforestry, but the land is classified as forestry, and some people are nervous about that. But there still is at least good grant and good support for the system. In Northern Ireland, we're trying to take policy forward to have an agroforestry measure over the next year or so that will help support farmers to plant trees. But aside from that, I mean, the benefits of trees are well proven. Most farmers like to have trees about their farm in some way or another. A lot of farmers are nervous of the effect that those trees has on their farm. They're nervous maybe about introducing woodlands or forestry on their farm, but they might be less nervous about introducing trees at wide spacing, where they can integrate them into a farm with very, very minimal effect, indeed positive effect, on the productivity of their whole farm. The benefits of tree fodder to animals is now really much more widely understood. These tree leaves carry a whole range of nutrients and protein and nutritional benefit that really benefit livestock. If you put sheep or cattle into a grass field with a hedge around it, the first thing they'll do is they'll go right round the hedge and they'll pick out and nibble off the leaves that they know are bringing them some form of nutritional benefit. So if you have them grazing through a woodland or a scenario where you have wide spaced trees, then they're getting the benefits from the leaves that fall from those trees. And if you have trees that are lower growing and produce side leaves and fodder like willow, which has a terrific value in terms of reducing methane emissions from the animals, and in terms of the health value, the benefits to their whole gut flora and nutritional system, and their worm burden. So those are the sorts of benefits that are really now coming to the fore, and people are realizing that these can bring huge benefits to farming systems, which make them more sustainable and acceptable to the public. You know, what's not to like about a system like this, where you have wide spaced trees, animals grazing peacefully below them, and it's stormy around about, yet it's shaded and it's sheltered down here, and the whole system just is ticking over as a healthy ecosystem, which is very, very resilient to climate change, to the sort of challenges that climate change is going to bring. And we know that the effect on the animal welfare is positive, nutritionally and in many other ways. And we're creating a healthy soil. If we wanted to try and probably thinking ahead of the sort of next generation of knowledge base we need to get to take the system forward, I would say it's managing the understory vegetation, the grass below us. We now know a lot of the benefits of multi-species swards, where you have plants that are rooting at different depths that will take carbon down to different depths, plants that have higher, for example, protein or nutritional value, some plants than others, plants that will come into leaf earlier than others, plants that are more shade tolerant than others. So if we had a sward mixed with all those species of plants, and there's a lot of research now showing that that does work, leading us towards a net zero or an arc zero situation. If we introduce those into agroforestry, into this situation where we have shade and shelter coming from the trees, it would be very interesting just to see the benefits that the multi-species swards, how they'll perform in that shaded environment. And we know that because of the shade tolerances, there's a lot of shade tolerance variation between grasses and other species. It's bound to give you a better nutritional grazing resource for the animals if you manage that properly between the trees. So thinking ahead, we can make these systems much more profitable. We can make them much more productive by maybe concentrating more on the quality of the trees that we grow, the timber we produce, and on concentrating on the quality of the sward that we have below us, and that will bring us benefits that the whole system will become more productive and more efficient. The agroforestry programme at Loughgall has continued to develop. We haven't just had the ash silvopasture, but about 10 years ago or so, we were involved in a trial in association with Daphne and Chagas, where we were looking at different clones of wild cherry. And this was really just about the time that ash dieback was starting to come in, but this trial was established to look particularly at wild cherry as a timber producing species. So we planted this site here in wide space cherry with ash as a nurse crop. So each tree was surrounded by 4 ash trees. Gradually over time, as the ash became more and more infected with dieback, we decided to remove all the ash, which we had done a few years ago, let the pasture underneath develop, and that left us with wide space cherry, which we've been able to graze. And for example, in the site just here, cattle have been grazing in here for most of the summer, and it really is. These trees have been managed properly. They've been pruned back to leave the crown about half the length of the total tree, and you can see just the form of the trees is tremendous. They're tall, they're straight, they're growing together, and the value of the timber in this stand will really be exceptional, and the growth rate, because of the spacing and the animal there, is exceptional as well. We've had very little disease problems in the trees. There are differences between clones. Some are better than others, and that's what the trial will find. But it heralds a great portent for using wild cherry in an agroforestry situation where you can combine the livestock with the trees and get a really valuable timber crop, whereas at the same time we have animals grazing. There's no tree protection needed. They don't touch it. They haven't done any damage to the trees at all. And really, this is a great asset, this site, for future research into systems like this. AFBI are now able to use this site for a whole range of very innovative research projects that are really helping to address some of the key things that we need to do in producing livestock systems which are sustainable and delivering for climate mitigation. For example, there's a focus on soil health. There's a focus on just looking at emissions, how emissions from grassland, how trees can help control those. The tree leaves will avoid or will absorb ammonia that emits from slurry, and those are that's the sort of research that the scientists are getting a handle on, which will help further demonstrate the value of introducing trees into grassland in a whole range of scenarios. So thinking back really over those 35 years since we started work here, I think it's been waves and troughs is one way I would look at it. At the start, we were filled with enthusiasm because we had good funding for this idea to set up this trial to see if silvopasture agroforestry would work. I think we showed it would work, but there was little interest really from any quarter in growing trees this way or in the system, because the real crises for agriculture hadn't really hit, or the real pressures on grassland farming hadn't really hit. So we went through a doldrum period. I should say doldrum, but we fortunately managed to keep the trial site going over the years, particularly with EU money and other research funding that the department put in to keep the site going. Now in recent years, in the last 5-6 years, it's clear that the information we've got from this site is going to be really valuable in going ahead, looking at ways that we can come up with sustainable farming systems which are nature friendly, and are, most importantly, are climate resilient, and enable farmers to continue to farm and produce income while at the same time diversifying across a whole scope of outputs to add added value to their income.